All right, everybody, let's get started again. This is part 2 of the module, and we're going to start talking about inspections. We're going to go over erosion and sediment control a little bit, and then we've got kind of an interactive exercise. We'll be looking for your input. We got a series of photos, and just talk a little bit about what's good and what's bad with those photos. So to start this off, just talk about the top 4 problems that were found during EPA inspections. The SWIP not being updated, that's not something that you have to be concerned with on an MS4 type permit inspection, because that's part of the general construction permit. Know that we're enforcing the construction element of the MS4 NPDES permit, and the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan is a requirement of the state general construction permit. So while the city's responsible to verify that there is indeed a SWIP, you're not responsible per se to ensure that it's being updated out in the field. Poor housekeeping was number 2, and then missing and incomplete inspection reports within the SWIP is number 3. Again, that would be something that is not strictly an MS4 inspection issue, but if you see problems at the site and you're going to be turning the site into the regional board, these are items that you can mention to the regional board inspector. And then the last one, which is probably the most common, is BMPs not maintained. I think that everybody's seen a lot of sites where people come out of the gate, they put them all in, they install them, and then the program is pretty much to just forget and not deal with them after that. Talk a little bit about, what to inspect and how to do the inspections. First and foremost, areas that are not at final stabilization. Dan talked a little bit about sediment being the primary pollutant, and that's absolutely the case. So areas that haven't been stabilized, finally stabilized, are the ones that are at the most risk of producing sediment runoff from the site. So that's going to be one of the areas that you're going to want to concentrate your inspection. Erosion and sediment control BMPs for sure, because again, you're looking to try to make sure that erosion doesn't happen, and if it does, that the BMPs that are responsible for sedimentation or removing those particulates from the flow are functioning adequately. You're looking for the evidence of or the potential for erosion and other pollutants to leave the site. So if you have a silt fence that is 3/4 of the way up, backed up with silt, that's something that's going to fail probably to the next storm event. So that's something that you would want to note in your inspection and have that corrected. So it's not only actual pollutants leaving the site, but the potential for pollutants to leave the site. Some of the potential pollutants are cement residue. This is a big one that we want to make sure is cleaned up on site. When runoff passes over the fine cement that can be redissolved, it dramatically changes the pH, and that's a problem for aquatic life. It can cause toxicity to aquatic life. Obviously, oil stains, petroleum hydrocarbons, they cause the oily sheen that you can see in the water. That's prohibited under the construction general permit as well as in your municipal codes. Trash is not allowed to leave the site under the state general construction permit or under your municipal stormwater ordinances. Non-stormwater discharges are always a big issue and problem at construction sites. You have porta potty washouts, you've got pumping of footings that may be filled up overnight with water from a rain event, wash water, things like that. In general, non-stormwater cannot be discharged from a construction site. If it's something that can be controlled, it's supposed to be controlled on site. The only thing that you can really discharge from a construction site is groundwater, and if that's being pumped, you have to get a permit from the regional board. It's probably going to be a waiver or a general permit coverage, but it still has to be obtained permit coverage. So construction-related water you're maintaining on site. In very rare instances, you could allow that to be discharged from the site if it's absolutely clear, and I mean you would consider drinking it. That's how clear it is, and if your city's NPDES coordinator agrees to it, because in general the MS4 permits prohibit dry weather discharges to the storm drain system, and your city has to follow up and document why there are dry weather discharges. So if you're going to allow that from a construction site, you would always want to check with your city's NPDS coordinator first. And the reason for that is really that dry weather flow in storm drain systems has been identified as one of the big issues from a sanitary quality perspective in terms of causing potential problems at beaches. Even if you put absolutely clear water into a storm drain, most likely it's going to come out the other end of the pipe and it's not going to meet sanitary quality standards. In other words, it's going to be a potential to cause a beach closure. And that's because bacteria, it turns out that pipes are the perfect location for bacteria to grow. And the water then that's discharged to it during dry weather can pick up that bacteria and cause problems downstream. So long story short, the cities are on the hook to eliminate dry weather flow, and that's why you've got to eliminate it at the construction sites as well. So the purpose of the inspections, obviously, to identify and correct BMP failures or potential failures. Again, we have pollutants and potential discharge of pollutants. So we're looking at things that are really in need of maintenance and would likely fail during the next storm event. And obviously then, as I've already said, to ensure compliance with the construction element of the MS4 program. The regional board is responsible for enforcing the construction general permit. You all are responsible for enforcing the construction element of the MS4 permit, which is really two things. It's the water quality ordinances that you have at your city and the grading and erosion and sediment control ordinance that you have at your city. So how do I inspect a site? From a water quality perspective, start at the downstream end of the site and move upstream. This is so you can identify any pollutants that are leaving the site, and then you can look for the sources of those pollutants, whether it be a failed or failing BMP or poor housekeeping or something like that, but you know what's leaving the site, and then as you're inspecting going upstream, you can find it. I was out on it was actually a 401 water quality certification in San Diego, and the regional board was there, and we were down in the creek because the board wanted to look at the resource housing development going in right upstream of the creek. And we found a couple of spray paint cans down in the creek, and the site superintendent was there, and he swore up and down it wasn't coming off of his site. No way, no way. We get up on site, and in his storage area, there was a case of that exact same spray paint. The box had broken open. A bunch of them had rolled down the street. There was one caught in the grate of the storm drain, and you could tell that they had rolled into the storm drain system. So, he lost all of his credibility. But that's a good tool that you can use when you're out inspecting the sites. Take digital photographs. A picture's worth really a million words in this case. Everybody's got a cell phone now. Pretty much every cell phone has a camera in it. It's very easy to do and provides very, undisputable evidence of what you're talking about during your inspection. Same thing with the BMPs. Inspect, downstream of the BMP, looking upstream, things like silt fences, straw wattles. And again, you're looking to make sure that it's functioning correctly and that it's not releasing sediment or any other type of pollutant. And if it is, what is the corrective action needed? And again, the potential or evidence of pollution leaving the site. I think everybody's seen the telltale white stucco in the gutter, sediment in the gutter, track out on the streets. Those are the things that we're trying to keep on site and are required as a part of the MS4 program. Key things to inspect while you're out there then, certainly I've talked about all disturbed areas because that's going to be the large sediment generator disproportionately on the site. Obviously, the perimeter controls, all sites need to have perimeter controls. Erosion controls give you the most bang for the buck, but every site needs to have perimeter controls. You're going to be looking at the conveyances, whether those be pipes or riprap, open channels or things like that to make sure that they're not scouring, that the energy dissipation's working. Looking at the receiving water edge, my little story about finding the paint can down in the receiving water. If your site discharges directly to a receiving water, just go down there and look. Is there any sediment in the receiving water? If there's any water there, is there any oil sheen? Do you see any stucco residue, things like that? And then go back on site and find the problem and make sure that it's corrected. All drain inlets have to be protected. So again, goes standard part and parcel with site perimeter controls. And then the storm drain outfalls and other discharge points. You may not discharge right to a receiving water, but you might go into a channel or something like that that you can, visually take a look at. And if there's no other flows commingled from other sites or other locations, what's there is probably coming off of your site that you're inspecting. A lot of times, I understand the storm drains are underground, it's out of sight, out of mind, so you just have to confine your inspection to the site. But if you have these opportunities, you should take them. Key items then, those are the locations. You want to look at certainly stockpiles. They have the potential to produce a lot of turbidity if it's, dirt, for example. So make sure that those are covered and have perimeter controls. Your solid waste storage, as Dan already indicated, trash containers have to be covered at the end of every day. That's to keep trash from blowing out overnight. Trash isn't supposed to leave the site. The sanitary facilities need to be back off the street. When they come to service them, they hose them out. That's a non-stormwater discharge. You don't want that non-stormwater discharge making it into the street and into the storm drain system for obvious reasons. All the hazardous materials need to be stored under cover. So that's usually in some sort of a, shipping container, something like that. The equipment and service and the fueling areas ideally would be covered. It's not required, but they need to be clean. You can't have, spilled oil or spilled fuel on the ground where rainwater can come in contact with it. So you just need good housekeeping there. Waste and borrow sites tend to be forgotten sometimes. They may be off-site at other locations. They're part of the construction project. So if you do have a borrow or fill site, it needs to have erosion and sediment controls. It needs to have tracking controls, everything that goes along with the other portion of the site. And then finally, concrete washout areas. They're supposed to be watertight now. And I'm not so concerned if those are leaking straight down. It's not going to contaminate groundwater or cause a problem from that perspective. But you are concerned if it's leaking and you get that cement residue out on the surface, because when runoff passes over that, it's going to dissolve that cement again. The pH is going to change dramatically, and that's going to be then a problem downstream for somebody else that's probably sampling on behalf of the city that's going to have to go up, trace that back, and try to find the problem. So make sure that any cement type things, and that can come from torn stucco bags or just poor aim when people are going to the concrete washout, make sure that kind of stuff is cleaned up. All right, so that's kind of the basic primer on inspections. Let's talk a little bit about some of the BMPs that you have in the toolkit and what you would want to apply. And kind of the thrust here is to understand how they work so that you can see if they've been misapplied or not applied correctly in the field and point that out. Erosion control is the first thing that I'm going to go through here. And again, it's really 70% of the benefit that you have out there. Ironically, mostly people put in the sediment controls, the silt fence and the detention basin and things like that, and then forget it usually. But most of the performance is going to come out of the erosion controls. And these are largely going to be things like spray-on binders, soil binders, polyacrylamide, starch, earth guard, those types of things that can be sprayed on out of a water truck, pretty cheap. These are going to last about one storm event. So if you've got a site that's being actively graded, they need to hit it with a soil binder then to make sure it gets through that rain event. Of course, have all the sediment controls that we'll talk about in a minute as well. And they'll be in compliance with the permit that way. Kind of the next step up are hydraulic mulches. These will last several storm events. And these would be used in areas where you're going to maybe be not working that area of the site for a couple months, and you want to be able to get through 6 months, say, of the rainy season. They usually have a dye in them, a green dye, as you can see. They go on about 1/4 inch thick. They're just wood fiber mixed in with a binder that we just talked about. And the problem here would be if they're applied and they're not applied, uniformly. If you have bare spots, those are obviously going to be problematic. Landscape mulch is something that can be used at the final stabilization step. This usually goes on a couple inches thick, does a good job of ensuring that there's no erosion. We're starting to see some of these landscape mulches actually leach nutrients, which is becoming a problem. But that's something that, will probably change over time. You may want to question if these are being used on an upstream of a water body that has a nutrient problem, but in general, they're very good for erosion control. Still better yet is bonded fiber matrix. This goes on very heavy. It lasts really several years, kind of almost indefinitely. It's really good at, if you don't have any hydroseed or anything, allowing volunteer vegetation to germinate. It's just very expensive. So use this when maybe on, say, a super pad or something like that. It's going to be idle for 2 or 3 years, and you just need to stabilize it to get a notice of termination before you come back in and restart construction. Straw mulch is really every bit as good as bonded fiber matrix. It just doesn't last as long. So it'll last about a year maybe, but it needs to be punched in. It needs to be crimped into the ground or some sort of binder sprayed on top of it. Otherwise, it's just all going to blow away. And then kind of lastly, in terms of erosion control, a very expensive option, but a good performer are Geotextiles Mats, rolled erosion control products. These need to go down on an absolutely smooth surface. If the surface isn't smooth, they're going to be up off the surface, and they're not going to work, because the way they work is by slowing the water down at that soil mat interface. So if they're put in correctly, they work very well. These are usually for pretty small areas that you just aren't planning on landscaping, because they are pretty expensive, but again, a good performer. And we got a picture on one of those. It's a problem at later on, but keep in mind, again, they have to have good contact with the soil. The slope has to be absolutely smooth, no track walking. The seams need to go down the fall line. They need to overlap. You need to be stapled well. And then the end game really, all the things I've talked about, the mats, the binders, the mulches, the bonded fiber matrix, they all need to be renewed and babysat and fixed. Vegetation is really the end game. It's where you're going. If you can get vegetation established, even if it dies later, you don't have to go back and fix it. The root system and the vegetation itself will stabilize and prohibit erosion from occurring. So encourage vegetation on your site whenever possible and get hydroseed down. Usually hydroseed is then followed by a shot of wood fiber mulch, something like that, to keep it glued down, because hydroseed is just water, fertilizer, and seeds. So it's not in and of itself an erosion control. After it germinates it is, but when you first apply it, it isn't. So they may need to shoot the hydroseed, then shoot a wood fiber mulch over the top of it to give it a chance to germinate and give you that erosion control benefit. Here's some charts just to show you, how much these things cost, and the sediment reduction, which is compared to bare earth. That's been done in some laboratory tests. But guar, that's a natural substance from beans. Starch, these are just sticky things that essentially glue the soil together. Polyacrylamide is essentially earth guard. It's just under a commercial name. So about $400 or $500 an acre to apply it. If you go up one step to the mulches like we talked about, straw mulch, wood mulch, bonded fiber matrix, you can see they're also effective but also more pricey. And what you're paying for is the longevity. The binders on their own are going to last a storm, whereas the mulches are going to last several storms, up to several seasons in the case of bonded fiber matrix. But again, you're paying for it at $5,500 an acre. And then the rolled erosion control products. There's a variety of those. We don't use the lower one there, the plastic mesh, anymore. Fish and Wildlife hates that. They don't want anything that's not biodegradable. But most of the rest of them, you really can't buy many of those anymore. The market shifts rapidly based on, the regulation. But again, you can use a rolled erosion control product to stabilize an area that's not going to be seeded ever, but you need to get notice of termination filing. So that's it for the erosion controls. Just kind of a quick overview of those. Let's talk about the sediment controls now. Things like silt fence, sediment basins, straw wattles, things like that. The first one's a silt fence. It's a sheet flow device. It needs to go on the contour. You know, one of the biggest abuses that I'm sure you've all seen is people putting silt fence in concentrated flow areas or running them down the fall line of a slope where it's just going to create a preferential flow path. These need to go on the contour. The post needs to go on the downhill side so the fabric gets pressed into the post, not pulls off, you know, if it was the other way around. And it needs to be keyed in. The fabric needs to be keyed in down into the earth. If you can see light under the silt fence, it's not going to do anything because it's a sheet flow device, right? You have very shallow sheet flow that's coming along, and it's just going to blow right underneath the fence. So basic things of installing a silt fence. Again, a sheet flow device, and the way it functions is by stopping the water. The particles settle out, and then the clean water bleeds through. It's not a filter. You're not filtering anything. If you were filtering, it would clog up very rapidly, so it's a detention device. Pretty much everything we talk about for sediment controls are going to be a detention device. Sediment basin, this is for concentrated flow then, concentrated flow areas. It has to be designed for per fact sheet SE2, that's in the CASCA manual, that's in the permit. Has to be designed per this fact sheet. And that just has basic design elements like, you know, sizing the hydraulics of the outflow tower, making sure that you have a, you know, riprap at the inlet and the outlet, and also making sure that you have a spillway. Anytime you impound water behind an embankment, you've got to have an emergency spillway if the primary outlet fails. And that was the problem with this picture, which you can't see really well. The primary outlet clogged, there was no spillway, and it just failed over the embankment. So not a good deal. Fiber rolls are a good perimeter control, also good for segmenting slopes. For risk level 2 slopes in the permit, it actually gives a little table as to what the spacing of these should be. They're very similar in operation to a silt fence. They're really just kind of a lower silt fence. They work by stopping the water, the particles settling out, and then the clean water bleeding through. So in the case of a slope, you're stopping the water, knocking the energy out of it, and it doesn't then have enough energy to start rilling the slope. How do you know if you've got good spacing on your straw wattles? If there's no rilling in between them, you've got good spacing. If there is, you need another row. But these need to be installed very carefully, kind of along the lines of a silt fence. If you can see light underneath it, the water's going to blow right underneath it, and it's not going to do any good. They need to be kind of trenched in and staked in really well to make sure you have that contact with the soil so that the water does have to stop when it hits the wattle, as opposed to, again, just blowing underneath it. And you can kind of see in this picture, these were well installed. There's a little bit of sediment built up behind the wattles. They're working exactly as they should be. Gravel bag berms, you know, these are things that can actually be used in the flow path. You see them a lot on undercut streets to prohibit rilling in between the gravel bags. They're also good for perimeter controls and chevrons and things like that because they're pretty heavy. But again, the principle is the same. You're stopping the water, the particles settling out, the clean water's bleeding through. You're not really filtering it. You're creating a lot of kind of a series of detention basins. So again, a very simple metric. How do I know if I have enough gravel bag lines set up? Well, if there's rilling in between them, you don't. If there isn't, you do. I mean, it's not too complicated to figure that part of it out. And then finally, inlet protection. Same thing. We're stopping the water behind the bags. The particles are settling out. Clean water is bleeding into the inlet. The filter fabric is very good to have during the dry season, but not the wet season. It keeps all the dirt and the trash out of the storm drain system, but you're not going to pass enough water through it during a rain event to not have the inlet clog or have the filter fabric push through. So just make sure that the fabric's taken up and the bags are what's doing the job when it's going to rain. But absolutely encourage the fabric during non-rainy seasons because you get a ton of dirt, a ton of trash into a brand new storm drain system, and that's all just going to flush out into the receiving waters during the first rain event otherwise. Entrances and exits, again, a very simple metric, either the street's clean or the street's not clean. And the regional board inspectors have a very low tolerance for dirty streets. And they're driving around and they'll see track out, they'll go back to, the construction site. And that's something that they'll jump on the city for. And there's kind of a progression, you've got a rock entrance and you've got rumble plates, so you can do rock and rumble plates. If that's not working, you can go to street sweeping as an add-on. And if that's not working, the final thing is a wheel wash. And around here, a lot of times during the rainy season, you're going to have to go to some sort of a wheel wash. That can be a laborer with a hose. That can be one of the fancy automatic ones like you see here. But a lot of times you're not going to kill the track out problem to the satisfaction of the regional board without some sort of a wheel wash, because we have clay soils and it sticks to the tires. So again, your inspection metric is very straightforward. Either the street's clean or it's not, and you've got the hierarchy and progression of tools then to make sure that you do achieve a clean street. Dewatering is another kind of tricky one. We already talked about it a little bit. If you are pumping any water on a construction site, you're going to need a permit or at least an okay from your city's NPDES coordinator. So if you're pumping out a sediment basin, the water better be absolutely clear, and for reasons we talked about before, your city's NPDES coordinator better be okay with that. If you're pumping groundwater, you absolutely better have coverage under a regional board permit for that. And I would not be shy at all about asking to see that coverage under the general permit. You cannot pump groundwater without a discharge permit. Can you discharge groundwater from your site if it's gravity flow? Absolutely yes. But does it have to go into your storm drain system? Not unless it looks absolutely clear. But yeah, you can discharge natural groundwaters that are under gravity flow from the site without a permit. But when you pump it, you got to have a permit. Material storage, pretty straightforward. It needs to be covered. Cover and contain all material storage. Concrete waste, we've talked about it. It needs to be watertight per the permit. What you're really looking for and should be concerned about is that cement residue on the ground that could get dissolved or picked up by runoff and then cause pH problems in the receiving streams. All right, so that's kind of the quick overview of how to inspect, what to inspect, the erosion and sediment control BMPs, and some of the good housekeeping BMPs. We wanted to focus a little more time on the interactive session here, so I'm just going to be throwing up pictures, and this is a free-for-all interactive part of the program here. Just tell me what you see is the problem with some of these, and we'll start with this picture right here. Obviously, there's a problem with erosion on this, but what's the underlying problem really here, the root problem that needs to be addressed? Yeah, there's flow coming over the top of the slope. It's a huge problem. Something that the QSD was asleep at the switch probably. You can't have uncontrolled flow over a 2-to-1 slope, or you're going to get gullying exactly like you see in this picture. So that needs to be regraded so that the water goes away from the top of the slope. Absolutely right. How about? Yeah, I mean, the way you'd slow it down, the only way I could see of handling it is putting it in some sort of a pipe or something like that, right, to get it down the slope. How about here? Housekeeping's bad. Anything else? Yeah, there's not really perimeter controls.
Well, it depends on whether that's just all on-site or if that's an active street or...
Right, right.
The big picture, you could have containment throughout the site and none of this could be within the site.
What do you think about this rock piled up in the gutter?
It's a rock pile in the gutter.
Yeah, that better not, it's kind of, it's a problem really, right? Because there's no track out control beyond that. So everybody leaving this part of the site, the dirt that's on the tires is going to be knocked out in that rock pile, which is right in the gutter. So that was probably put there just to they thought they were doing a track out control and then to keep the curb from getting marked up. But it's really, yeah, curb ramp, I agree with you, but it's actually depositing pollution right where water's gonna flow, so it's something that needs to be corrected. And yeah, the housekeeping, this is big debris, but if a windstorm comes up, all that stuff is gonna be blowing off the site. And where does it end up? It ends up usually in the creeks, because they're the low points of the landscape. It's where all the water flows. It's topographically low, so all of this trash tends to blow into the creeks, where the city again would be responsible for it. So during the day, it's not windy. Is this a big problem? No, but when everybody's gone at night, could get windy. The site needs to be cleaned up on a daily basis. This is a live inlet. Doesn't take a lot of thought to figure out what's going on here, which is nothing. So, this type of thing just, can't be allowed to persist for longer than a day. How about this shot here? There's some good things and some bad things that are going on. What do you see?
There's no control over the entrance or exit there.
Right, we got the same kind of tracking problem. Trash bin, yeah, no containment. There's no cover. It looks like it's kind of spilling out. I like the porta potty placement. I mean, I think that's good. It's back off. If the guy washes out the floor, it's not going to make it to the gutter. They do have a roll-off or some sort of a cargo container there for hazardous materials, but then they got stuff stacked on top of it. So that's kind of cheating the system, right? I mean, they got most of the way there and then kind of blew it at the end. You see the little bit amount of dirt or, broken AC or something in the street? That's going to be enough for the regional board inspector to write it up. It needs to be just a little bit cleaner than that. You can see the silt fence. It kind of just dies and sort of looks like it's messed up, at that point. It's probably not a real clean ending to that. It needs to go all the way up to the track in, track out, which also needs to be fixed.
You can also see that the AC is lower than the lip of gutter, so that's not the final paving yet.
Correct, yeah.
That's not the end of the site, so, this may not be all of the BMPs that are in place. They may be outside of the limits of this picture.
True,
Not giving anybody credit for anything, but
true. Yeah, he better have good inlet controls though too, right? On the storm drain that probably serves that street. This one's hard to see, especially on this projector, but the gist of this one is that the rock entrance is really spent. If you get a sharp version of this picture, you can see that the voids of the rock are actually filled up with dirt. And the point being here that these things have to be taken out and new rock put in, new fabric and then new rock down, because after they fill up with dirt, they're not going to really function anymore. They're going to be kind of a net zero, and so those have to be maintained periodically. How about here? Yeah, fuel spill. All right, it's an auxiliary power unit. It's diesel. It's on the ground. It needs to be cleaned up, and the proper way to clean that up is dig it out, goes into a hazardous material drum, gets the licensed hauler to take it off site. How about here? Who's down with this? Dirt in the street. Can you think of a worse place to put it? I mean, in the pile, yeah, it goes right in the gutter. So if it rains, the flow is going to come along there and drill a hole right through that pile. It's going to produce huge amounts of sediment. So, the stockpile is not covered, doesn't have any containment around it, but, there's no way that this should persist more than a day on a site that you control. Just say, look, I'm going to be back tomorrow, and that pile better be out of the street and it better be all swept up, because you don't put stockpiles in the gutter. You can see some other materials, some rebar lying there. That's not good housekeeping. It's not a real environmental concern. You know, construction materials in their final form aren't a problem. When they're stockpiled, they can be. You're gonna get elevated iron levels coming off of that pile of rebar. Is that an environmental problem? No. I mean, iron is not that toxic, and it takes a lot of it to cause toxicity. That, strictly speaking, should be back and under a cover. If that was, say, hand railings that were hot dip galvanized and that was all zinc, you betcha you're going to get enough zinc coming off of that if it rained to actually cause toxicity in a stream where it goes to. So that's something you'd want to be aware of. So in general, construction materials just need to be kept under cover. What about this?
Looks like a makeshift washout that lost all protection.
Yeah, makeshift washout. So what's the basic fundamental design variable for a washout per the permit? Has to be watertight. This one isn't watertight. Why do they have to be watertight? It's because the main thing we're worried about is changing the pH of the runoff water. You know, this is just the water's going to hit this, pick up all the concrete, and blow right through the wattle. The wattle's going to do nothing to enhance or reduce or eliminate the pH change that's occurred. So this is just, you know, somebody knew they had to do something, but they weren't too interested in really doing much more than trying to apply the eye wash. How about here? Yeah. Yeah, no construction entrance or exit, and there's dirt in the street, so two, you know, noticeable offenses right there. How about here? Yeah, the perimeter control is the screen, right? So obviously there's not good perimeter controls here. What else do you see in the picture? Sediment in the gutter. I see trash in the gutter. I see beyond that.
Oh, catch basin.
Yeah, an unprotected inlet. So again, here you're just standing on the sidewalk. You see several things. You know there's no perimeter controls. They don't have an inlet control, and they haven't been keeping the trash and things picked up. This is a storm drain connection, goes to a pipe and outlet. How would you protect this? What would you do to protect this, which obviously is not protected right now? Yeah, gravel bags. Put a couple high and a couple deep probably, maybe some rock down in the landing area to keep it from scouring. Obviously, this needs help. This is a shot of straw rolled erosion control product. And we got vegetation coming up through it. Maybe. Now the problem here, and this was a site that I was called out to, it's a little hard to see, but the vegetation's coming up through the blanket and it's lifting it up off the ground. These guys couldn't figure out, well, they just spent a bunch of money on blankets and they couldn't figure out why they were getting something like 1,200 turbidity units, you know, in their sampling, and they were all beside themselves. We went back and we pulled up a piece of this blanket and it was just all rilled underneath it. And it's because the contractor that put it down only stapled the edges of the blanket. You need to have a staple every 3/4 of a square yard. Like we talked about, it has to be in contact with the soil for it to work. So it started getting some vegetation, pushed all the blanket up, it rolled underneath the blanket. So the fix here was to pull up all this blanket. It gets destroyed when you pull it up. Throw it all in the dumpster, regrade all the slopes, buy new blanket, put it all back down. A huge amount of money, a huge waste of resources, a huge trash generator. So geotextile blankets work very well if they're installed correctly. So if you see them being poorly installed, you know, I would just stop it right there because you're going to save a lot of resources. This was a big waste of time and everybody's money. How about here? Yes. Yes, exactly. The Visqueen salesman was successful at this site, and I think his kids are all the way through college probably. But what I want to point out is, you see how there's kind of a dip in the visqueen. It's the same problem that we had on the previous slide. They put down visqueen, which was a good attempt, but it just gullied right under the visqueen. And the same thing happened at this site. This is a cul-de-sac down, the downhill cul-de-sac, and there's an inlet down there. Huge amount of sediment came out onto the golf course. Well, I can tell you exactly how much came out onto the golf course. It's about 5 feet wide and 6 inches deep and about 400 feet long. That's the volume of sediment, and it was just excavated under that visqueen. So something like this is evidence of pollution leaving the site. And they got to pull up the visqueen, redo the street, and do something else. In this case, what we did was pave the street. We just put down 2 inches of AC, which was going to be sacrificial for later, because this is an 8% street, and this is kind of sandy material, so there's not a lot else you could do. If you had, enough gravel bags to stop it, you'd have 700 per foot or something like that. The other problem was, too, you can see the parkway area wasn't protected, and there's a little line of, kind of a rill starting going down there, too. But look for, you kind of have to be a forensic guy when you're out there and say, look, there's obviously erosion occurring under this visqueen. It's obviously not cutting the mustard. You got to do something else. Here,
Looks like until it's sloped there, it looks like some sediment control. You need chevrons or something to stop it. Oh, you can see them at the bottom of the picture. Looks like
Yeah.
bags.
Yeah, so they have some, but there's not enough, right? What was the fundamental rule that we just talked about? If you got rilling in between the bags, there ain't enough of them. Again, this is a pretty steep street, and they need probably twice the gravel bag chevrons to knock the energy out of the water to keep it from rilling in between them. They just don't have enough. So you're getting a lot of turbidity. The turbidity is going to make it all the way through and out to the creek. What would be the big red flag here that should be catching your attention? Note that it's a nice sunny day. There's water in that ditch, yeah. We just spent a lot of time talking about non-stormwater discharge. This was just continuously running into the storm drain system. So your poor NPDS coordinator at your city is going to get called out and have to start some sort of investigation of why there's dry weather flow at a storm drain outlet that's never had it before, and it probably has the sanitary quality problems and stuff. This is a job that was constructing a roller compacted concrete dam, and they were using water to cool the gravel pile because the aggregate has to be cooled to go into the RCC mix. And this water, though, was just continuously running off the pile and going right into the municipal storm drain system. And we talked to the contractor. It was a pretty easy thing for him to set up a little detention basin and pump it back up onto the pile. Problem solved. But non-stormwater discharges from the construction site, 99.9% of them need to be stopped. So this type of a thing, if you see it, you got to start asking questions. This is just an uncovered stockpile, no big deal. Site like this, this is, again, a larger grading site, and Dan's going to come back in and talk about small sites, but what do you do in a case like this? The whole site's open up, they got scrapers and graders everywhere. How would you protect this site? What would be the basic requirements that you would impose on this site? It goes back to the fundamentals, right, of what we talked about. The erosion controls, so there better be perimeter controls and at least a basin somewhere downstream, correct? Or sediment controls, rather, that's the sediment controls. And then the erosion control side of the equation. This whole site could be hit with some sort of a binder. And that's actually going to function pretty well. If I hit it with Earth Guard is actually a coagulant, which sticks particles together, but it's also a flocculant. Once this water all flowed down into the sediment basin that you had created, the Earth Guard's actually going to make the smaller particles kind of be attracted to each other and stick together, and they get bigger and then they fall out. So it enhances the operation of your sediment basin. So if you just have the basics on a site like this, I know it looks undoable, but if you have the downstream sediment controls and then the basic erosion controls, you're going to meet the requirements of the permit. Same thing on a slope like this, right? I mean, if you went out there and said, hey, I want to, you know, these guys are actively working the slope, they're probably doing some sort of a buttress or something back up. If you go out there and say, hey, I want straw wattles on that slope, you're going to be laughed off the site, or probably worse than that, actually. So it's not practical, it's not functional. If it's going to rain tomorrow, you could still have the same thing in place, right? The downstream sediment controls, and hit this thing with EarthGuard, polyacrylamide, something like that to get you through that one storm and be prepared then to start work the next day again. But doing nothing violates your MS4 permit, violates the construction general permit. What about this? It's a straw wattle used as a check dam. Does it look like a good idea? No. I mean, straw wattles aren't permeable enough and aren't the right tool to be used as a check dam, which should be riprap that has a downstream landing pad and be keyed into the sides. So if you see stuff like this, it's doing more harm than good, and just make them take it out. You can see that the water piled up and then it couldn't go anywhere, so then it just, you know, blew out to the side and created additional erosion. If they hadn't done anything, we would have been better off in this location. Wrong tool for the job. Straw wattles are a contour device, a sheet flow device, not a concentrated flow device. I just threw this picture in because I thought it was neat. This guy was coming along, and obviously the Caltrans permit engineer underestimated either the bridge height or they told him the wrong height of their excavator. This is a picture of the 91 freeway. We were out inspecting that on the widening between along Green River there. So what would give you pause about this picture? There's a lot of goofy things going on here, but I mean, again, go back to the basics. Let's start with the slopes. Unprotected, right? I mean, there's a risk level 2 site. You've got to have straw wattles at certain intervals. So the slopes, I can tell from looking, there's no erosion control, but there's no sediment controls on the slopes. If you want to buy into the visqueen, I guess that's your business, but at least fix the hole in the middle of it and continue it all the way over, correct? I mean, they just lost interest there at some point. This looks like it's going to be a conveyance, a flow path. So we need to have gravel bags in there to make sure that we're not going to get erosion, rilling as the water's flowing in there. You also see what looks like a lot of crushed up concrete. That's something, there's probably enough of it in kind of a powdery form where it's going to be a potential to have a pH problem. That's something that I would probably want to see cleaned up. You know, at first it's kind of goofy and it's not pretty, but again, just go back to the basics. Is there erosion controls? Is there sediment controls? In this case, we had a half-hearted attempt at some visqueen for erosion control, and that was it. And that obviously isn't enough to get you to the goal line. So what's missing from here? A spillway. I heard somebody say it. Can't impound water without a spillway. If the primary outlet fails, the embankment's going to fail. Huge problem, huge liability. And you know, that's something obviously the site owner is going to be cited for and bear the brunt of it. But if you were out there inspecting a site and you let something like that go, I think the city's liable too. You know, the lawyers are famous for that, right? Anybody who is even practically breathing the same air as the guy that really caused the problem gets thrown into the lawsuit. So you don't want to open up some liability for your city because, you know, you let a poor design like that go. Wish I had this in video form, but you know, the water's actually flowing over the silt fence there. So what's the problem here?
Nothing to stop the swimming out of the water before it gets to the silt fence.
It's concentrated flow. Silt fences are not a concentrated flow device. They're not. Water weighs 62.4 pounds per cubic foot. Stack up a couple of feet of that, it's 120 pounds of pressure pushing on a wood stake. Give me a break. It's not going to happen, let alone the velocity of the force hitting it too. You can see here they even tried the double silt fence approach where they put in two, this was across a creek. It's the wrong tool for the job. Don't let the stuff persist on your site because this is going to be the result. And how about here? This was an arterial roadway.
Is that an active stream?
Yeah, that's actually, there's actually some dry weather flow coming down there. That's a good eye off to the right. And then that goes off into an active stream over on the right-hand side. Yeah, I mean, just from this picture, that's the best, I think the best way to put it. There's nothing. I don't see any erosion controls, any sediment controls, any perimeter controls. Again, basics, erosion, sediment. This is the last one, and this is just a shot of a good site by comparison. This site was shut down in 2007 with the crash, and the developer said, we're not going to touch it for probably 5 years. In fact, it just really did start construction again. For the first 2 years, they did essentially nothing after they shut it down, and they got cited by the regional board. So this was in year 3. And they spent $1 million on this site, but I'll tell you what, it is absolutely performed beautifully through 2 seasons. This whole huge slope that you see has, wattles at the right interval, but then they also sprayed it with bonded fiber matrix. Down in the flatter areas, they use wood fiber mulch. You can see the green. And then where that grader is, they just went in and put in an inch of AC over that to keep the streets so they could drive on them and check all the erosion controls. So they tried to cheat the system at the start, but came back and did an absolute bang-up job. And like I said, this site met every, they were doing sampling out there for turbidity, met every single storm event, had no exceedances of the action levels for turbidity. So it can be done. It just takes some effort and a lot of cash to do it. But don't let people tell you that it can't be done, because it can. All right, so that's it. We'll take another 5-minute break, and then Dan will finish up, and we'll have you out of here by 12.